Lecture 6, Emergence and World Parent Creation Myths.
In our last three lectures, we have been looking at creation myths of different cultures. In fact, in those last three lectures, we focused on a myth or a series of myths from one culture at a time: the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Hebrews. In the next two lectures, we're going to do some globe hopping. We're still going to be using the same taxonomy that we introduced back in lecture 2 about dividing creation myths into separate categories. But we're going to be looking at different creation myths from different countries using that taxonomy as a way of making sure we get them all covered. In this one, we want to talk about a type called the Emergence Myth and a type called the Separation of World Parents Myth. In an emergence myth, the creatures which are usually thought of as not quite or completely human travel upwards through a series of chambers or underground worlds until they emerge into this one, the one that we still live in. These myths usually assume an already created world with a sun and sometimes gods already in place, but the creatures themselves are what has to change. They have to become human as they make their way upward. These emergent stories are very characteristic of Native Americans in the southwest part of this country, and they're also frequent in Mesoamerica. The Aztecs have an emergence myth, the Acoma have an emergence myth, as do the Pueblo, the Zuni, and the Navajo. The Navajo is the one we'll use in this lecture to look at because it's probably the most accessible in Paul Zolbrad's Dine Bahane, which is a kind of Navajo Bible, or at least the Navajo creation story. As Zolbrad points out in the introduction to his book, the creation story that he recounts there is still in the living oral tradition in the Navajo countries themselves. That is, the stories are still being told by storytellers, which means that the stories keep changing. Different circumstances, different storytellers will give different emphases, will stress certain points. So this is the first of our myths that we are looking at that is still very much alive in the oral tradition. Zolbrad admits that, of course, writing down his particular version of it freezes that particular version of it in time, as writing down a myth always does. And he says, in fact, that whenever we look at something that has been frozen like this, from the oral tradition, frozen by having it written down, in a way it's like looking at a fossilized paw print of some ancient prehistoric beast. We can get some idea of what the beast was really like, but nothing like what the beast really is. The living beast somehow always escapes from that fossilized print. The Navajo story itself begins with insect-like creatures living in a deep chamber underground. They aren't very much like us. They are more like insects than like us, as a matter of fact, but they can fly, and so they are called throughout this part of the account, they're called air spirit people. They live in an underground chamber that has no light. It's extremely crowded, and so the story tells us there's a lot of confusion, a lot of messiness, a lot of fighting, and a lot of adultery. We're told that they keep trying to clean up their act. They get together every so often and try to fix things, but somehow they never quite manage it. The four chiefs of this underground world, one for each cardinal direction, eventually get irritated enough with them that they tell them they're going to have to leave. They can't put up with this messiness anymore. The insect people, the air spirit people, meet to try to figure out how they can meet this challenge, but the meeting turns out to be mostly a blaming session, with everybody blaming everybody else for what's really gone wrong. While they're still squabbling, huge waves of water come at them from 4 different directions, and until they look like they're going to be drowned. Fortunately for them, they can fly, so they all take off into the air until they come to the hard shell of the sky, and there they're trapped. The water is rising below them, and the sky, this they see as a kind of impervious dome, something they can't get through. They're trapped. So suddenly a member of the swallow people appears to show them that there is a slit somewhere in that sky, and they find their way to that slit, and they make it up through that slit, and then they reach the surface of the second world. The idea here is that the sky of one underground chamber is the floor of the next one, and so on up through these chambers. This world, it turns out, is inhabited by the blue swallow people, whose blue heads matched the color of this entire world. The last world was red, this one is blue. After a period in which these two different peoples simply watch each other, the insect people send out reconnaissance missions in all four directions to find out what kind of world they're in. All four of them come back reporting there's nothing out there. There are no people, there are no plants, there are no rivers, there are no mountains, just blue, bare, level ground. Then the blue swallow people themselves come for a conference and tell them that they had wasted their time with all of their reconnaissance missions, that they could have told them that no one was out there. No one has ever lived here except for the blue swallow people. The insect people ask for permission to stay, and they promise that they will try to live peaceably among the blue swallow people, and they're given permission. For a while, things go well, until, as the text says it, one of the strangers became too free with the wife of the swallow chief, and trouble erupts all over again. The swallow people say this must be why they got kicked out of their last place, and now they say you're going to be driven out of this one too. Besides, they remind them there isn't enough food in this world to keep everyone alive, so you're going to have to leave sooner or later anyway. Now, because of the trouble, it's just going to be sooner. So it's off again for the insect people. This time once again to an impervious sky, and this time it's white wind who guides them through the slit in the shell, which is the sky of this world, and they go through the slit and they reach the surface of the third world. This turns out to be the world of the grasshopper people. It's a yellow world. The first one was red, the second one is blue, and the events here follow pretty much the same course they have in the other two places. Again, they have to fly to the sky shell, and once again, they find that they can't get through it, and again, this time their helper is red wind. They are directed through a slit that is discovered into the fourth world. This world is much larger than any that they had been in before, and its colors are primarily black and white. There's no sun and moon yet, but there's enough light for the insect people to send out couriers again in every direction to see what kind of world this is. The couriers find nothing in three of the four directions. Each of the four directions is marked by a mountain peak, and they head toward the mountains. But in three of the directions they come back, they say they can't find anything, and the mountains are so far away, they despaired of ever reaching them, so they return with no report to give. In the north, however, something interesting happened. There, the couriers who went out to the north discovered a race of people who, they say, cut their hair square in front, who live in upright houses, and who know the arts of agriculture. The next day, two of these people come to visit the insect people, and when they do, they bring along corn and pumpkins to feed them with. The two people now begin to try again to live amicably with each other, and the square-haired people teach the insect people how to cultivate and irrigate their own crops. In time, the insect people here also hold meetings to figure out how to avoid getting thrown out of this wonderful new world. This is by far the best one they've ever been in, and they really do not want to get kicked out of this one. Eventually, and they do clean up their act sufficiently so that they seem to get along, they're going to be allowed to stay. Then they ask the gods of this new world, the holy people, to make human beings, which they do. The gods show up one day, the holy people show up one day with 2 buckskins and 2 ears of corn. They lay the 2 ears of corn on one of the buckskins, they cover it with the other one. They place eagle feathers underneath the ears, and then when the wind blows into the buckskins, the holy people walk 4 times around the buckskins. When the top buckskin is lifted, the 2 ears of corn are gone, and in their places are a man and a woman. The white ear has become the man, the yellow ear has become the woman. We have here another one of those examples that we talked about in our last lecture. The wind and breath here are once again very clearly alloforms of each other. The breath that is in us comes to us from the wind, and when we breathe out, we return our breath to the wind. And as the Navajo story tells it, it says, this is the breath that comes into us and we live, and when the breath goes out of us, we die. This first couple gives birth to 5 sets of twins, and when they are grown, the holy people take them to the eastern mountain to teach them in ritual and ceremony and magic. And when they return, they come back, they sometimes wear masks, we are told, and they pray for agriculture and they pray for rain. But this kind of magic is always ambiguous, particularly among the Navajo, because when they came back, they said they sometimes wear the same kind of masks that witches do. Witches too wear masks, and like witches, they're forced to marry close relatives. So that there's a sort of power that comes back with these people, a power that we'll talk about later when we talk about shamanism that can be used either for good or for ill, and the Navajos knew very well about that kind of power. There's one odd detail in this story, and that detail is that why is it that the insect people ask for human beings to be created? Usually in stories like this subhuman kind of creatures who make their way through underground worlds, by the time they emerge, they become humans, and we expect that that's the way the story is going to end as well. There is a comparable Zuni myth, or in fact two myths, that are comparable to this, which have the right expected ending. The first is one in which when these creatures emerge into the fourth world, they still have goggled eyes and they have scaly skin and they have webs between their fingers and toes. They actually more crawl than walk. But they survive, and as they live, their eyes get used to the sun. They assume more and more upright positions. Eventually, they lose the scaly skin and they lose the webs between their fingers and toes, and they become human beings. That's one version of a Zuni story. Another comparable version is that two sons of the sun, these two sons are the ones who've helped them into the fourth world, feel sorry for them, and so they come down, and each night they perform a series of surgeries on these people. One night they cut them mouths so they can eat. The next day they realize that they can eat, but now they can't defecate, so they have to create a hole at the other end. The third night they come and they cut the webbings between their fingers and toes, so that bit by bit what they do is they help these creatures who are subhuman, as they develop through the four chambers, become human beings. And that's kind of what we expect will happen in the Navajo story as well. That's why we're surprised when we see that the insect people, instead of becoming human, ask that humans be created. There are possible ways of explaining this. That it may be that this is kind of a way of describing the last stage of creation in a kind of parable form, and that may be what's happening. It's also been suggested that perhaps what we have here is two parallel creation stories which are simply laid side by side in the same way we saw happened in the book of Genesis. Another interesting detail of this story is that in each underground chamber is associated with one cardinal direction and with one color. It isn't until we get to the fourth world that all four directions are available in the four mountain peaks, and the various colors all blend together into white light. All of these details are going to be used in Navajo sand painting, which recreates the creation story as part of a healing ceremony, where these colors and cardinal directions are going to be very, very important. There's a really wonderful developmental process. Even if these insect people don't themselves quite become human in this story, there's a wonderful developmental process that goes on among these insect people as they emerge from one underground chamber to the next. They develop both biologically and morally. They develop more and more toward complete humanity as they move up, and they also learn eventually to discipline themselves, to avoid doing the kind of things that get them kicked out of every successive world that they've been in so far. By the end, they are fully integrated into the new world and with those people who already lived here. It's been suggested, that's another interesting detail of this story, that those people that they met in the north who cut their hair square in the front and live in upright houses may be a mythologized memory of the Navajo meeting with the Pueblo, who had already mastered an agrarian way of life and who already lived there when the Navajo arrived. Getting kicked out of various worlds for bad behavior may sound to us a little like the Adam and Eve story. That's what happens when they disobey, they get kicked out. But here, there's a marked difference in emphasis. There is no particular penalty that goes along with this disobedience as there is in the Genesis story: painful childbirth, hard work to wrest a living out of the earth. For the Navajo, this fourth world is a beautiful place. It's a grand place. It's the kind of place that they get as a kind of reward for learning how to manage their own lives. So that there's nothing fallen about this world. For them, this is the reward. Once they learn to develop in a certain kind of way, they are given this world as a kind of reward, which marks a significant difference between this and the way Adam and Eve get kicked out of their garden in their version. Emergence myths, all of them, including this one, have great homologies with the birth of a child from the womb, from darkness into light, growing from incompleteness to completeness. Frequently in emergent stories, not this one, but frequently, the helper figure who helps these creatures as they move from chamber to chamber is a female, like Spider-Woman, who acts as a kind of midwife to what happens. So these stories, emergent stories, are full of female images. They're full of dark, hidden caves from which life emerges. Because of that, Charles Long in his Alpha thinks this may be among the oldest kind of myth, dating back to the Neolithic or even Paleolithic cultures, the ones that had the drawings and carvings of females with huge breasts and buttocks, and suggesting that female forms were among the earliest religious forms and at some point were the sources of great power. We'll talk about this more when we get to our next unit. The long time underground spent by these creatures suggests a kind of gestation during which we grow into full humanity. Long lists a Zuni myth, which makes perfectly clear how these parallels between the womb and these underground chambers work in this kind of story. This is a description of the lowest of these chambers in which these people live. Anon is the nethermost of the 4 cave wombs of the world. The seed of men and creatures took form and increased. Even as within eggs in warm places, worms speedily appear, which growing presently burst their shells and become, as may happen, birds, tadpoles, or serpents. So did men and all creatures grow manifoldly and multiply in many kinds. Thus, the lowermost womb or cave world, which was called Anosin Tehuli, and then he defines this. This is the womb of sooty depth or of growth generation, because it was the place of first formation, and black as a chimney at nighttime, foul too as the internals of the belly. Thus did it become overfilled with being. Everywhere were unfinished creatures, crawling like reptiles over one another, one spitting on another or doing other indecency, insomuch that loud became their murmurings and lamentations, until many among them sought to escape, growing wiser and more manlike. In emergence myths, what we see is the metamorphosis of the human being as analogous to the metamorphosis of the fetus in the womb, and so that the power that is manifest when these creatures break into the fourth world is the same power, the same powers of creation that happens in every single human birth. So this is an example of an emergence myth and what a typical emergence myth might look like. The next one we want to take a look at is of a different sort. This has to do with the breaking up of initial unity like earth and sky. We've already had some experience with this one. We saw in the Egyptian myth, we saw Shu separating Geb and Nut in Lecture 3. And in Lecture 4, we had Apsu and Tiamat, who were not earth and sky, but who were blended waters. And in both cases, creation flowed out from the separation of the two. As we've seen, the idea is always that in the beginning, there's unity, there's stasis, there's entropy. Creation can only happen when this unity gives way to multiplicity, to division, and to growth. But it also leads to dissolution and death. The best and worst of this whole world spring from that division of some primordial unity into separateness and individuality. The example we're going to use here is from the Maori, who are Polynesian natives of New Zealand. In this story, in the beginning, there was only Rangi and Papa. Rangi is the sky, Papa is the earth. And in this story, Rangi lies so closely on top of Papa that although they are breeding and conceiving and giving birth to children, there is no room for the children to move. There is no light. There is no place for them to go. Eventually, when the children get numerous enough and powerful enough, they have a meeting of their own in which they decide that something has to be done about this. They have somehow to force their parents apart, to make a space for themselves to live and to give themselves access to light. When they have a meeting, they disagree about what they should do about this. The fiercest child is one named Uwenga, and he says, just kill both of them. Just kill both the parents. Just be done with it, and then we'll have as much space as we want. But Tana Mahuta, who is the lord of the forests, says, why don't we just try pushing them apart? We'll give ourselves some space. We'll send our father far, far away, and we will stay with our mother. All of the brothers agree that this is probably the most sensible plan, except one, Tahiri Matea, who is the father of wind and storms. And he says, well, why do we have to do anything? Let's just leave things exactly the way they are. There's a certain amount of disagreement among these brothers, which will turn out into open feuds later. Well, they have decided they're going to try to push them apart, and one by one, all of the sons try and fail. There is, in addition to the brothers we've already mentioned, there's a lord of cultivated food, there's a lord of reptiles and fish, there's the lord of food which needs no cultivation. Each one of them tries to push the mother and father apart, and they all fail. Even the fiery Te Mata Uwenga tries and fails to do it. Eventually, Tana Mahuta, who's the lord of the forest, whose idea this was in the first place, he puts his head against his mother, his feet against his father, and with a mighty effort and with screams of protest from Rangi and Papa, he finally rends them apart. It seems as though the children have succeeded and all seems well, except that, remember, the brothers didn't get along with each other. Tahiri Matea, who's the god of wind and storms, is so put out by what's happened that when his father is pushed out into remoteness, he goes to join his father, where the two of them plan revenge on the rest of the family. So the god of storms releases clouds and winds and squalls against his brothers, and eventually this is going to turn into a kind of full-scale civil war of brother against brother. They start out, the winds first attack Tane Mahuta's forests. And what happens is the trees are snapped in half and broken down, and limbs and boughs are scattered everywhere, made food for insects and for rot. Great destruction he wreaks on his brother's forests. Then he attacks the seas and drives them into such violence that even the Lord of the Seas dives to the bottom, and all of the fish that are in the sea dive to the bottom for safety. And all of the reptiles, deciding the sea is not safe anymore, make their way to land and find refuge in Tana Mahuta's forests. This starts a civil war that has been going on ever since. That is, the sea and the forests are always at war with one another. The forests to this day provide spears and fishhooks and nets and canoes for people to go out and destroy the offspring of the sea. And the sea tries to swallow those canoes, to sink them, as well as attacking the lands and the trees whenever they get a chance. Tahiri Matea also tries to attack the two brothers who are the lords of cultivated and of uncultivated food. But this time Papa, the mother, takes them back into herself and hides them where they are safe. So that after all of this war is over, they are going to be able to emerge and still be there. Then finally, the Lord of the Winds attacks Te Mata Uwenga, the fiercest one. He is, of course, the ancestor of human beings. By the time he stands to face against the Lord of the Winds, he's full of contempt for his brothers who yielded so easily to the God of the Winds, and he stands against them alone until the God of the Storms becomes tranquil. Then he turns his attention to his cowardly brothers, eventually, as the story has it, eating all of them and taking their attributes for himself. He really was angry with them for what they had done. He cannot, however, finally in the last analysis, cannot defeat Tahiri Matea, the god of the winds, and the story ends this way. Thus Tu Mata Uwenga devoured all his brothers and consumed the whole of them, in revenge for their having deserted him and left him to fight alone against Tahiri Matea and Rangi. So that in a way, this is very clearly, this is an ideological myth. The God who is the ancestor of humans subdues and masters and subordinates everything we need to survive. Fish and reptiles and forests and cultivated and uncultivated foods. But the one brother he never defeats is the brother who causes hurricanes and tornadoes and raging storms that can still knock us out. No way we're ever going to defeat that one. In cosmological terms, we're back on familiar ground again, the same places we have been before. It's a pattern that we've identified in other myths of a primal unity leading to a kind of division and individualism. The union of sky and earth is always inert. We remember in the Enuma Elish, Apsu wants to kill his offspring just to have things quiet, to put them back to where they were. When the crisis of separation comes, the mother sides with her children, or the children side with the mother in this case. The Mother Earth is always friendlier than the sky, which is still powerful, but it is remote and detached from our everyday lives. Here, Mother Papa hides away the children who provide food, that is both cultivated and uncultivated food, so that they can survive, so when the battle is all done, they can reemerge and human beings will have something to eat. The primal unity in all of these stories is always pictured as a perfect blending of male and female, so that everything at that moment is still mere potentiality, still possibility. This myth, in fact, begins with a description of that goes like this. According to the traditions of our race, Rangi and Papa, or heaven and earth, were the source from which, in the beginning, all things originated. Darkness then rested upon the heaven and upon the earth, and they still both clove together, for they had not yet been rent apart. And the children they had begotten were ever thinking amongst themselves, what might be the difference between darkness and light? They knew that beings had multiplied and increased, and yet light had never broken upon them, but it continued dark. Generally, as we've seen in all of these stories, children are the agents of separation. They want light, they want room to move, they want room to grow. Here, the god of storms, however, goes with his father, which makes sense because, again, etiologically, that's where storms seem to come from. But by going with his father, he also manages to allow his father to retain some of his authority, even when he becomes remote. But typically, as we said, children stay with the mother, as the myth says, so that she can nurture us as the earth does. In our next unit, we'll take a look at the hypothesis of the great goddess, the idea that in Paleolithic and Neolithic ages, the female principle was supreme in religion and mythology. The idea of the earth as a great goddess and a mother was probably strengthened in some ways by the change from hunting and gathering or nomadic life to agriculture. When the earth becomes what we depend on for fertility of plants and domesticated animals, our connection has to be closer to the earth than to the sky. The sun becomes in a way more important than the sky. In the Zuni myth, the father-son impregnates the waters near Mother Earth, and they produce a pair of twins who teach humans how to cope with the new world. The sun becomes friendlier and much more imminent, much more of daily use than the sky does. And so, as always, history and time begin in this story with the overcoming of that initial inertia and with separation. And once again, as in all of the other stories, sexuality becomes a driving force and an ordering element, as opposed to the eternal union of Apsu and Tiamat, or Geb and Nut, or Rangi and Papa. Or, as we've seen in past lectures, with the Midrash's androgynous Adam, in which energy and change and creation doesn't really happen until those genders are split up, or Hesiod's all-male golden age, which isn't ended until Pandora is introduced into the world, or Plato's myth in the Symposium that we all started as androgynous beings. This sexual difference also is a mighty powerful driving force in all creation myths, this kind included. Next time, we will look at two other different kinds of creation myth. One is the creation from chaos, or in its most popular version, a cosmic egg, in which a cosmic egg floats upon the eternal seas or sails slowly rotating through the skies until it gets broken or cracked, and then creation begins from there. The other kind of story that we will take a look at, the other kind of myth we'll look at next time, is ex nihilo. Now, we've already had some experience with both kinds of these myths, but we'll expand our repertoire by taking a look at some examples from other parts of the world. And as always, we'll try to spend some time comparing and contrasting with myths we've already looked at, and then trying to figure out what it is that these myths have to say to us. That's next time.